After I signed my house over to my daughter, my new accommodations were in the pantry, a space barely large enough for a bed, let alone a life. They had no idea I saw this coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Stick with me through my story to the very end. The day I signed away the deed to my house was the day I effectively ceased to exist in my own life. I truly never imagined it would come to this. At 72, with arthritis making its daily, grinding argument with my joints, and still recovering from a minor stroke the previous spring, I had concluded it was time. It was time to pass my cherished Victorian home to my daughter Emily and her husband Brian. For 43 years, that house had been more than just a structure. It was my sanctuary. It was where I'd raised my only child, where I'd mourned the passing of my beloved wife, Eleanor, 15 years ago, and where I'd carefully cultivated a modest reputation as a watercolor painter. "You'll always have your place here, Dad," Emily had promised, her eyes looking so earnest as we sat across the desk in Miss C. Peterson's law office, the scent of old paper and fresh ink hanging in the air as we signed the documents. "We'll take care of everything," Brian had added, nodding beside her. His smile, I remember, was a perfectly crafted thing that never quite managed to warm his eyes. "It will be wonderful having you with us, Arthur." I should have recognized the warning signs right then and there. The way his hand squeezed Emily's just a fraction too tightly, the barely perceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. But I was committed to believing them. I needed to believe I was doing the right thing for my family. What they remained blissfully unaware of was a prior consultation I'd had with Jonathan Wells, an old friend from my college days who had become my attorney. "Arthur," he'd said, his voice serious as he leaned over the expansive mahogany of his desk, "let me add a special clause, just as a precaution to protect you." I had agreed without giving it a second thought, feeling a sense of relief to have a safety net, but never truly imagining a day would come when I would actually need it. Just 2 short weeks after the property transfer was finalized, Emily and Brian assisted me in moving out of the master bedroom, my bedroom, for over 4 decades into what they cheerfully referred to as my new space. I followed them down the familiar hallway, my feet shuffling on the hardwood floors. We went past the guest rooms where my grandchildren sometimes stayed, then down the back staircase and into the room that had, for all my years in that house, been the pantry. "We fixed it right up for you," Brian announced, gesturing with a theatrical sweep of his arm into the small space. The walls had been painted a sterile, clinical white. A narrow twin bed was shoved against one wall, and a small, cheap dresser stood against the other. My heavy wooden easel was wedged awkwardly into a corner, my precious paints and canvases stacked in cardboard boxes beneath it. "The guest rooms are being turned into permanent rooms for the kids," Emily explained, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder, refusing to meet my eyes. "They need their own dedicated space for when they come to visit." I stood there in the doorway, a leaden weight settling in my chest as I took in the suffocating, windowless room. The air was thick with the faint, lingering smell of old onions and harsh cleaning chemicals. "There's no window," I whispered, the words barely audible. "We had a high-quality ventilation system installed," Emily said quickly, her tone overly bright. "And there's plenty of light." She flicked on the overhead fixture, and a single, harsh, fluorescent bulb blazed to life, casting sharp shadows and making the room feel even more like a prison cell. Brian glanced at his watch. "We should get going if we're going to make our dinner reservation. The moving guys will bring the rest of your boxes down here." And just like that, they left me. I was left standing there, surrounded by the barest essentials of my long life. All of it condensed and compressed into a space smaller than the bathroom I had just vacated. I sat on the very edge of the bed, my hand tracing the pattern on the thin, generic comforter. It wasn't the handmade quilt my dear Eleanor had left me, the one that had always graced my bed upstairs. That night, I lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of the house from my new, lowly vantage point. The incessant hum of the refrigerator just outside my door, the groaning creak of the pipes overhead, and the muffled, distant sounds of Emily and Brian's laughter floating down from what had once been my bedroom. Over the next few days, I did my best to adjust. I arranged my few remaining belongings as best I could in the cramped space. I set up my easel and tried to paint, but the garish fluorescent lighting distorted the colors, turning my vibrant landscapes into muddy, lifeless scenes. When I asked about bringing down one of my antique floor lamps from the attic, Brian gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Oh, we donated all of those," he said. "We really had to declutter, Arthur." His tone implied I should be thanking him for the favor. This house has so much potential, but it was just stuck in the past. At meals, I couldn't help but notice that my handcrafted pottery dishes, each piece a memory, had been replaced with sleek, modern plates devoid of any character. My extensive collection of vintage teacups, gathered over decades of weekend trips to flea markets with Eleanor, had simply vanished. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about them, Emily looked deeply uncomfortable. "Brian thought they were taking up too much cabinet space," she mumbled, avoiding my gaze. We packed them away, but I never saw those boxes again. One afternoon as I approached the kitchen, I overheard Brian on the phone. "It's challenging having him here," he was saying, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "He's like a ghost, haunting the place, wanting everything to stay exactly the same. Emily doesn't see it, but he's preventing us from making this house our own." I froze in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe. "No, we can't put him in a home yet. The optics would be terrible. We just got the house." There was a pause. "The pantry works for now. It keeps him out of the way." I backed away silently, a sharp, physical pain of hurt and betrayal tightening in my chest. That night, for the first time since being relegated to the pantry, I cried. They were quiet, muffled sobs, buried in a pillow that wasn't even mine anymore. The next morning, I put on my bravest face and joined them for breakfast. Emily had already left for work, and Brian barely glanced up from his phone as I entered the kitchen. "There's toast if you want some," he said, his tone absent and dismissive. I made myself a cup of tea in a heavy, unfamiliar mug, the silence stretching between us as I wondered when my daughter's home had become a place where I was merely tolerated. As I stirred a spoonful of honey into my cup, I suddenly remembered Jonathan's words about the clause in the deed of protection I had never believed I would need. Now, I wasn't so sure. The days bled into weeks, and I watched, powerless, as my very presence was methodically erased from the house I had loved for more than 4 decades. Each morning seemed to bring a new, small heartbreak. Another piece of my history quietly removed and replaced. My watercolor paintings, the modest works that had once lined the hallway, disappeared overnight. In their place were generic, mass-produced prints of beaches and cityscapes that Brian had ordered online. The antique grandfather clock, a wedding gift that had ticked away the hours of my marriage, my fatherhood, and my widowhood, was suddenly gone from its place in the entryway. "We sold it," Emily informed me over breakfast, her eyes focused intently on her bowl of oatmeal. "It didn't fit with the new aesthetic." "The new aesthetic," I repeated softly, the words feeling foreign and bitter in my mouth. I wanted to ask her when my home, my entire history, had been reduced to an aesthetic to be discarded. But I swallowed the words, along with my tasteless breakfast. My garden suffered the same fate, The vibrant roses I had painstakingly nurtured for 20 years, the hydrangeas that exploded in brilliant blues each summer, the fragrant herb garden I had tended to daily, all of it was ripped out. It was replaced with what Brian grandly called low-maintenance landscaping. Now, sterile gravel paths and spiky ornamental grasses stood where my beautiful flowers had once danced in the summer breeze. "It's more modern," Brian explained one afternoon when he found me staring out the window at the desolate transformation. "And honestly, Arthur, you weren't able to maintain it properly anymore. It was becoming an eyesore." I nodded silently, feeling another piece of my heart crack. That garden had been my solace after Eleanor died. Each blossom was a poignant reminder that beauty could continue even after profound loss. Now it was gone, deemed unnecessary and inconvenient, just like me. The day I found my Boston fern, a resilient plant I had kept alive for 15 years, dumped in the garbage bin behind the house, something inside me finally shifted. I retrieved it, its long fronds bent and damaged, but still stubbornly alive, and carried it back to my pantry room, under the harsh glare of the fluorescent light. I made it a silent promise that we would both survive this. But surviving became increasingly difficult as my isolation deepened. I would often hear Brian's friends visiting, their boisterous laughter floating down from the living room I was no longer invited to enter. During these gatherings, Brian would casually mention that I should stay in my room to rest. "Dad's not feeling well today," he would say, his voice loud enough for me to hear through the thin wall. "The doctor says we need to keep him quiet." There was no doctor. There was no illness, except perhaps for the slow, creeping sickness of being systematically erased from my own life. One Thursday afternoon, I overheard Brian talking to his friend Kevin in the kitchen, just outside my door. "It's such a burden," Brian sighed dramatically. "Emily doesn't see it, but having him here is like having another child to take care of. A very demanding, very outdated child." Kevin made sympathetic noises. "Can't you just put him in a home? There are some nice places now." "Not yet," Brian replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It wouldn't look right so soon after getting the house. People would talk." "How long do you have to wait?" Kevin asked. "A year should be enough. We'll say his health declined suddenly." I sat frozen on my bed, the rescued fern trembling slightly in my hands. A year. They were giving me a 1-year grace period before disposing of me completely. Even my grandchildren, who were once so affectionate, now kept their distance. 10-year-old Liam and 8-year-old Sophie used to run into my arms the moment they arrived for a visit. Now, they hovered awkwardly in my doorway, clearly under strict instructions not to bother Grandpa. "Grandpa needs his rest," Brian would say, steering them away. "You can say hello, but then let him be." One Saturday, Liam slipped into my room while his parents were occupied upstairs. "Grandpa," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Why do you live in the pantry now? Mom said it's because you're old. But Mr. Henderson is older than you, and he lives in a real room. Out of the mouths of babes." I hugged him tightly, breathing in the sweet, innocent scent of his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are hard to understand," I told him gently. "But I'm okay." He looked doubtful. "Dad says we shouldn't come in here because it's depressing." Before I could formulate a response, Brian appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of irritation. "Liam, what did I tell you about disturbing Grandpa?" He pulled the boy away, offering me a cold, dismissive smile. "Sorry, Arthur. You know how kids are. No boundaries." After they left, I sat on my bed, my hands trembling slightly. Was I depressing? Had I become something to be ashamed of? Something to be hidden away like a shameful family secret? That night, I heard Emily and Brian arguing upstairs, their angry voices carrying clearly through the heating vents. "I don't understand why he can't join us for dinner anymore," Emily was saying. "He's my father, Brian." The doctor said, "What doctor?" "He hasn't seen a doctor in months." "Fine, fine. But he criticizes everything, Emily. The way I cook, the changes to the house, nothing is ever good enough. I can't take his constant judgment." I had never criticized Brian's cooking. I had never criticized anything. I had become so cautious, so terrified of being even more of an unwelcome presence, that I barely spoke at all these days. "He's just old-fashioned," Emily said, her voice softening, already weakening. "He'll adjust. It's been months, and he still looks at me like I've stolen something from him." "Haven't you?" I thought bitterly. "Haven't you stolen my home, my dignity, and my relationship with my own daughter and grandchildren?" Their voices faded as they moved to another room, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of my thoughts. I pulled out the small photo album I'd managed to keep, one of the few possessions that hadn't mysteriously disappeared. I traced my finger over a faded picture of Emily as a little girl, gap-toothed and smiling, her small arm wrapped tightly around my waist as we stood in front of this very house on the day we first moved in. Where had that little girl gone? When had she become this woman, who either couldn't or wouldn't see what was happening right before her very eyes? As I tucked the album back into my dresser drawer, my fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of cardboard I'd almost forgotten. "Jonathan Wells, attorney at law." I pulled out the business card, staring at the embossed letters, and remembering the clause he had insisted on including in the deed transfer, the one I never thought I'd need. Maybe it was time to call an old friend. I had been actively avoiding the neighbors. Each time I saw someone I knew approaching on the sidewalk, I would quickly duck back inside or pretend to be intensely busy with the wilting potted geranium that now constituted my entire garden. The profound shame of my situation, being relegated to a pantry in my own home, kept me in a self-imposed isolation. That changed on a crisp autumn morning when I ventured outside to collect the newspaper from the driveway. Leo Harrison, my neighbor of 30 years, was meticulously pruning his rose bushes across the street. Before I could retreat into the shadows of the porch, he called out, his voice booming across the quiet street. "Arthur, I haven't seen you in weeks." Leo was 80, a full 5 years my senior, with a spine as straight as a ruler and the sharp, observant eyes of someone who misses nothing. He crossed the street with surprising speed, his gardening shears still clutched in his hand. "You're thin," he declared, assessing me with a frank, unapologetic gaze. "And pale, like you haven't seen the sun in months." I attempted a weak smile. "I've just been adjusting to the new arrangement." His eyes narrowed. "New arrangement? You mean being banished to that back room while your son-in-law redecorates your house in that ridiculous modern style that looks like a soulless furniture showroom?" My mouth fell open. "How did you?" "My son visited last week. Brian gave him the grand tour to show off the renovations," Leo snorted. "He said he barely recognized the place. Said it was like you'd been erased." Hearing the simple truth spoken so plainly, like you'd been erased, broke something inside me. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. Leo didn't offer any platitudes or awkward gestures of comfort. He simply took my arm. "Come on, come have tea with me. My arthritis isn't acting up today, and I just made scones." That morning, sitting in Leo's sun-drenched kitchen, surrounded by his eclectic collection of mismatched teacups, so similar to the ones Brian had disposed of, I found myself telling him everything. The pantry bedroom, the discarded possessions, the overheard conversations about putting me in a home. Leo listened without interruption, his expression growing more grim with each detail, occasionally topping off my teacup from his steaming kettle. When I finally finished, my voice hoarse, he set down his cup with a decisive clink. You know what this is, don't you? He asked, his voice firm. I shook my head, feeling lost. Elder abuse, he said bluntly. Financial and emotional. And you're just letting them do it. Emily is my daughter, I whispered, the words feeling like a weak excuse. My only child. And that gives her the right to treat you like an inconvenient houseplant? Leo's voice was gentle despite the harshness of his words. Arthur, you were a beloved art teacher for 30 years. You ran the Cultural Center's community programs. You organized the Historical Society. When did you become this doormat? I stared into my teacup, watching the ripples spread across the surface. When did you become so direct, Leo? He laughed. A deep, rumbling sound. The day my Helen died 10 years ago. I suddenly realized I didn't have time for nonsense anymore. He reached across the table and grasped my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. And neither do you. That afternoon, Leo introduced me to his Thursday walking group. There were 5 of us in total. All men over 70, all widowers, all facing different variations of the same societal invisibility that had nearly swallowed me whole. There was Martin, who had discovered his daughter had been siphoning money from his accounts to pay for a vacation home. Peter, whose son constantly threatened to take away his driver's license despite his perfect driving record. And Steve, whose grandchildren only visited when they needed money for college expenses. We call ourselves the Gray Rebellion, Peter said with a mischievous wink as we strolled through the park, the fallen leaves crunching under our feet. Sounds more dignified than the Angry Old Men's Club. For the first time in months, I laughed. A real, genuine laugh that came from deep in my chest. These men understood. They didn't pity me. They recognized my situation because they had all lived through their own similar battles. What did you do? I asked Martin, curious about how he'd handled his daughter's financial exploitation. Changed my bank, changed my will, and changed my locks, he replied matter-of-factly. Then I took a cruise to Alaska with the money she thought I didn't know about. I enrolled in law classes at the community college, Peter added. Not to become a lawyer at 76, mind you, but just to understand my rights. Knowledge is power, Arthur. Remember that. Knowledge is power. That phrase echoed in my mind as we continued our walk, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs. I thought about Jonathan's business card tucked away in my drawer, about the protective clause he had added to the deed transfer. I hadn't called him yet, still hesitant to take such a definitive, irreversible step against my own daughter. The next morning, as I returned from another invigorating walk with Leo, I noticed a large truck parked in our driveway. Men were carrying out furniture. My furniture. The antique writing desk that had belonged to my grandfather. The heavy oak armoire my Eleanor had lovingly refinished as a 5th anniversary gift. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding against my ribs. Emily stood in the driveway, supervising the loading. What's happening? I demanded, my voice stronger and clearer than it had been in months. Emily started, clearly surprised to see me outside the house. Oh, Dad, I thought you were resting. What are they doing with my furniture? I pressed, gesturing toward the truck. She shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. We're updating the guest room. These pieces, they just don't fit the new design. Those aren't just pieces, I said, my voice shaking with anger as I watched the men struggle with the armoire. That's my history. Your mother made that for me. Emily had the grace to look ashamed for a fleeting moment, but then her voice hardened. It's not practical anymore, Dad. We need to move forward. Forward? By erasing the past? I gestured to the truck. Where is it all going? The consignment shop on Maple Street, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. They gave us a fair price. A fair price? As if my memories, my life with Eleanor, could be valued by strangers who saw only old wood and an outdated style. Later that evening, after they had gone out, I slipped out of the house and walked the few blocks to the consignment shop. There, in the brightly lit front window, sat my grandfather's writing desk, a price tag dangling mockingly from the drawer pull. Through the glass, I could see the armoire against the back wall, Eleanor's careful craftsmanship reduced to a vintage find for someone's country chic decorating scheme. As I stood there on the sidewalk, the evening light fading around me, I pulled out my phone and the worn business card. It was time to understand exactly what that clause meant. It was time to reclaim my power. Jonathan Wells's office hadn't changed in the 15 years since my last visit. The same worn leather chairs, the same towering wall of law books, the same framed diplomas from prestigious universities. Even Jonathan himself, though his hair had transitioned from salt and pepper to a distinguished white, maintained the same thoughtful demeanor and patient smile I remembered. "Arthur," he said, rising from behind his desk to greet me with a warm handshake. "It's been too long." I settled into the chair across from his desk, clutching the handle of my briefcase tightly. "I need to know about the clause, Jonathan, the one you added to the deed transfer." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, as he pulled a thick file from a cabinet. "I wondered when I might be hearing from you. To be honest, I was hoping I wouldn't." "Things haven't exactly gone as I expected," I said, the understatement of the year. Jonathan's eyes softened with sympathy. He extracted a document from the file and slid it across the desk to me. "Section 4, paragraph C," I directed. I scanned the dense legal jargon until my eyes found the passage. "In the event that the grantor, Arthur Joseph Wright, is subject to neglect, mistreatment, or unsuitable living conditions while residing on the property, the grantor reserves the right to revoke the property transfer. Such revocation must be supported by documented evidence of said conditions and will result in full legal ownership reverting to the grantor." My hands trembled slightly as I looked up at him. "This is legally binding?" "Completely," Jonathan confirmed. "Emily signed it, though I highly doubt she read it thoroughly. Most people don't." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Arthur, what's been happening in that house?" I told him everything. The pantry bedroom, my discarded possessions, the deliberate isolation, the overheard plans for my future. As I spoke, Jonathan took meticulous notes, occasionally pausing to ask for a clarifying detail. When I described finding my furniture in the consignment shop, his pen stopped moving. "They're selling your personal property without your consent?" I nodded. "Items that were never included in the house transfer." Jonathan's expression hardened. "That's theft, Arthur. Plain and simple." "They're my family," I said weakly, the excuse sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Family or not, they're breaking the law," he said, setting down his pen. "If you want to invoke this clause, you're going to need evidence. Photos, recordings, witnesses, anything that documents the conditions and the treatment." I left Jonathan's office with a clear plan and a small, discreet digital recorder tucked into my coat pocket. The weight of it felt both terrifying and empowering. I was no longer just enduring. I was gathering evidence. I was fighting back. The next day, a Saturday, I took photos of my pantry room while no one was home. I documented the narrow bed, the lack of windows, the inadequate storage. I photographed the empty spaces on the walls where my paintings had once proudly hung. I visited the consignment shop again, this time to document my furniture with the price tags clearly visible. Leo accompanied me, providing moral support and, more importantly, serving as a witness. "You should have done this months ago," he muttered as we left the shop. "I kept hoping Emily would see what was happening," I admitted, my voice heavy with disappointment. that she would stand up to Brian. Leo patted my arm gently. Hope is a wonderful thing, Arthur, but action is better. That evening, I heard Emily and Brian arguing upstairs, something that was becoming a more frequent occurrence lately. Their voices carried clearly through the heating vent near my bed. This time, instead of trying to block them out, I activated the recorder. We can't afford this renovation, Emily was saying, her voice strained with stress. Not after the kitchen and the landscaping. The realtor said the bathroom needs to be updated if we want to get top dollar, Brian insisted. I froze. Realtor? I still don't understand the rush, Emily said. We just moved in. This was never our forever home, Emily. You knew that. This neighborhood is too old, too stuffy. The house has served its purpose. It gave us a mortgage-free start and good equity. Once we sell, we can build exactly what we want. And my father? What about him? There was a pause. Then Brian's voice, colder now. We've discussed this. Golden Sunset Acres has an excellent reputation. It's a nursing home, Brian. Assisted living facility, he corrected her sharply. And it's perfect for his stage of life. He can't live independently. That's why he's here, remember? He needs supervision. He gave us this house because we promised to take care of him, Emily protested, though her voice lacked any real conviction. And we will be, by making sure he's in a place where professionals can attend to his needs. We're not equipped for this, Emily. I'm not a nurse, and you work 60 hours a week. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling a gasp. They were planning to sell my home, and put me in a facility. The betrayal was a physical blow, but the confirmation of my deepest fears also brought a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't just about making me uncomfortable until I left on my own. This was a calculated, deliberate plan. I continued recording as Brian laid out their timeline. List the house in the spring, move in the early summer, and have me settled into Golden Sunset Acres before their planned trip to Europe in August. We can use some of the proceeds to cover his care, Brian was saying. The rest goes toward our custom build. And if he refuses? Emily asked. He won't have a choice. Dr. Linden already thinks he needs more care than we can provide at home. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen Dr. Linden in over a year. When did she say that? Last week, when I spoke with her. You spoke with my father's doctor without him there? Emily sounded surprised, perhaps even a little concerned. Someone had to, Brian replied smoothly. Arthur forgets things, gets confused. Dr. Linden agreed. A cognitive assessment is in order. I turned off the recorder, my hands shaking with a potent mixture of rage and fear. Brian was laying the groundwork to have me declared legally incompetent. The steps were so chillingly clear now. Isolate me, stress me, and then claim that my deteriorating mental state required professional intervention. The next morning, I checked my small savings account, the one Emily didn't know about, and discovered the balance was significantly lower than it should have been. I requested a list of recent transactions and found several withdrawals I hadn't made, all within the past 3 months. Someone had been systematically taking my money. Someone who had access to my personal information, who could have found my bank card and my belongings while helping me move. I called the bank immediately to report the fraud and change my access credentials. As I hung up, I noticed an email notification on my tablet. It was from the county property tax office, confirming a change of mailing address for all future correspondence. I hadn't requested any such change. With a growing sense of dread, I checked my email's trash folder and found a series of deleted messages from my credit card company, my insurance provider, and my pension fund, all confirming address changes I hadn't authorized. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just about pushing me out or selling the house. They were systematically taking control of my finances, my medical decisions, my entire life. I sat on my narrow bed, clutching my tablet, the glowing screen a testament to their profound betrayal. Outside my door, I could hear Brian humming to himself as he prepared lunch, sounding perfectly content with his perfectly calculated plans. I thought of Eleanor, of how fiercely she would have protected me from this. I thought of Emily as a little girl, looking up at me with trusting eyes, believing I could fix anything in the world. But Eleanor was gone, and that little girl had grown into a woman who was failing me in every way imaginable. No one was coming to save me. I would have to save myself. The evening of Brian's dinner party arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather you read about in books. The air was crisp, the skies were clear, and the leaves on the maple trees lining our street were just beginning to turn brilliant shades of gold and crimson. For 2 weeks, he had been meticulously planning this gathering, inviting Emily's colleagues and their spouses for what he called a sophisticated soiree to cement Emily's networking opportunities. I only knew about the party because I'd overheard his detailed instructions to the caterer while I was pretending to nap in my room. By early afternoon, the house was filled with the tantalizing aromas of expensive food. Delivery men were carrying in cases of wine, and Brian's increasingly frantic directives echoed through the halls as he managed the staff he'd hired for the evening. At 4 o'clock, he knocked on my door, a rare acknowledgement of my existence. "Arthur," he said, not bothering to step into my room, "we're having important guests tonight. Emily needs to make a good impression on the senior partners." I looked up from the book I was reading. "That sounds nice. It would be best if you just stayed in your room," he continued, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "We'll have the caterer bring you a plate later." I nodded docilely, playing the part of the compliant, invisible father-in-law. "Of course." Brian looked relieved, perhaps even surprised by my easy acquiescence. "Good. Thank you." He started to close the door, then added, "We'll try not to disturb you." After he left, I sat motionless for several minutes, listening to the sharp click of his dress shoes as he walked back up the stairs. Then, I carefully opened my dresser drawer and removed the outfit I had been saving for just such an occasion. A simple but elegant navy suit I'd purchased on my outing with Leo last week, along with a pair of pearl cufflinks Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary. I showered in the small half bath adjoining the kitchen, arranged my silver hair neatly, and took a moment to look at my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized myself. The defeated man with the downcast eyes had been replaced by someone with a quiet purpose, someone who refused to be erased. By 7, the house was filled with the low murmur of conversation and the pleasant clinking of glassware. I waited, timing my entrance with care. Through my partially open door, I could hear Brian holding court, his voice pitched to carry across the room. "The renovations have been extensive," he was saying. "The house had such potential, but it was so outdated. We've practically rebuilt it from the inside out." "It must have been a massive undertaking," a woman's voice responded. "How long have you owned it?" "About 6 months," Emily answered. "It was my father's house before." "Oh, and where is he now?" the woman asked. There was a brief, awkward pause. "He lives with us," Emily said, her voice suddenly strained. "How lovely," the woman continued, oblivious to the rising tension. "I wish my own father lived closer. The children miss him terribly." It was the perfect cue. I stepped out of my room and walked calmly into the living room, where 20 well-dressed guests were gathered with cocktails in hand. The conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned in my direction. "Good evening," I said pleasantly, my voice steady despite the frantic racing of my heart. Brian stood frozen by the fireplace, a glass of wine halfway to his lips. Emily blinked rapidly, her expression a mixture of shock and profound embarrassment. "Dad," she managed to stammer, "I thought you were resting." "I'm feeling quite well, thank you," I replied, moving further into the room. "I wouldn't want to miss the chance to meet your colleagues." A distinguished-looking man with silver hair stepped forward, his hand extended. "You must be Mr. Wright. I'm Richard Townsend, senior partner at the firm. Your home is absolutely beautiful." I shook his hand, smiling warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend. This house has been in our family for quite some time. I raised Emily right here." "Richard, please," he said. He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is my wife, Catherine." Catherine took my hand in both of hers. "It's so lovely to meet you. I was just saying how wonderful it must be for Emily and Brian to have you living with them." "It's certainly been an adjustment," I said truthfully. "But family is family." Brian had recovered enough to approach, his smile brittle and forced. "Arthur, I didn't realize you were joining us. Let me get you a drink." "Scotch. Neat. Please," I said, naming the one drink he knew I never touched. "And I'd love to hear more about how the renovations have been going. I haven't had much of a chance to see the changes from my room." Catherine's brow furrowed slightly. "Your room? Did you keep your master suite when Emily and Brian moved in?" Brian interjected quickly, his voice a little too loud. "Dad's room is quite private. He prefers it that way." "Actually," I said, accepting a glass from a passing server, "I'm in what used to be the pantry. There are no windows, but the ventilation system is quite efficient." A ripple of awkward silence passed through the group. Richard cleared his throat, while Catherine looked from me to Brian with barely concealed confusion. "The pantry?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "But surely that was just a temporary arrangement," Brian cut in, his voice pitched higher than normal, "while we renovated the guest rooms." 6 months is quite a long temporary period," I observed mildly, taking a small sip of the scotch and managing not to grimace at the burn. "Especially since the guest rooms were finished 3 months ago." Emily stepped forward, her expression pained. "Dad, maybe we should show everyone the renovations?" I finished for her. "I'd love that, Emily. I haven't seen the upstairs in months." Before anyone could object, I was moving toward the grand staircase, trailing a wake of curious guests. Emily had no choice but to follow, along with several of her colleagues and their spouses. "The master bedroom has been completely redone," I narrated as we ascended the stairs. "It used to be quite traditional. Handcrafted furniture, family quilts, paintings by local artists." "Local artists?" asked a younger woman. "How charming." "Yes, I taught art at the community college for 30 years, I explained. "My students often gifted me their work." We reached the landing, and I led the impromptu tour down the hallway to what had once been my room. Brian had indeed transformed it into a sterile hotel-like space with generic artwork and not a single trace of the warm, personal touches that had once made it mine. "It's very contemporary," Richard's wife offered diplomatically. I nodded. "Quite a change." I moved to my closet, and opened it before Emily could stop me. "And so spacious. Much larger than the converted pantry downstairs." The awkwardness in the room was now palpable. Brian appeared at the top of the stairs, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Everyone, dinner is being served," he announced, his voice tight. "Shall we?" The guests filed back downstairs, murmuring among themselves. I caught fragments of their whispered conversations. "Can't believe it. The pantry of all places. If my daughter ever treated me that way." As I passed Brian, he gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low and furious. I met his gaze calmly. "I'm introducing myself to my daughter's colleagues." "Is that a problem?" "You're embarrassing, Emily," he whispered furiously. "And yourself?" I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. No, Brian, for the first time in months, I'm not embarrassed at all. Throughout dinner, I was the model of grace and charm. I shared stories of Emily's childhood that made her colleagues laugh. I complimented the food. I asked thoughtful questions about their work and their families. In short, I was everything Brian had tried to present himself as, the perfect host in a perfect home. By the time dessert was served, the dynamic at the table had shifted completely. The guests directed their conversations toward me, genuinely interested in my experiences and opinions. Emily's expression had transformed from mortification to something approaching deep shame, and Brian seethed silently at the head of the table, watching as his carefully orchestrated evening crumbled around him. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Catherine Townsend took my hands in hers. "Arthur, it has been a true pleasure. Richard and I would love to have you over for lunch sometime." "I'd like that very much," I replied sincerely. After the door closed behind the last guest, the fragile facade shattered. Brian whirled on me, his composure completely gone. "How dare you?" he spat, his face contorted with rage. "You've ruined everything." I stood my ground, no longer the meek, compliant man I had been pretending to be for months. "What exactly have I ruined, Brian? Your image? Your plans to ship me off to Golden Sunset Acres while you sell my house?" His face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "I know everything," I said quietly, my voice resonating in the sudden silence of the room. "The planned sale, the nursing home, the unauthorized access to my accounts, all of it." Emily stepped between us, her expression stricken. "Dad, that's not—" "Don't lie to me," I cut her off, my voice sharp. "Not anymore. I have recordings, Emily, and bank statements, and witnesses." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, facing my daughter and the man who had tried to erase me, I felt stronger than I had in years. Whatever happened next, I was no longer invisible. I was no longer powerless. I was Arthur Wright, and I was taking back my life. The days following the dinner party unfolded in a tumultuous blur of confrontations and revelations. The next morning, Emily attempted to smooth things over, approaching me with a cup of coffee and apologies that were heavily tinged with excuses. "Dad, I know things haven't been ideal," she began, perching awkwardly on the edge of my narrow bed. "But we never meant to hurt you." I studied my daughter's face, the face of the girl I had raised, now the face of the woman who had failed me so profoundly. "Intentions matter far less than actions, Emily, and your actions have been crystal clear." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "Brian can be difficult, but he doesn't mean—" "Stop," I interrupted quietly but firmly. "I have listened to that excuse for months. I won't listen to it anymore." I reached under my pillow and pulled out the large manila envelope containing the evidence I had so carefully gathered. The photographs of my living conditions, the bank statement showing the unauthorized withdrawals, the printouts of the emails confirming address changes I hadn't requested, and a full transcript of their conversation about selling the house and placing me in Golden Sunset Acres. "This is what you've done," I said, placing the heavy envelope in her hands. "Not what you meant to do, not what you hoped would happen, but what you actually did." Emily's hands trembled as she leafed through the documents. "Dad, I had no idea about some of this. The bank withdrawals, the mail forwarding, I never authorized." "But you allowed it," I finished for her. "By looking the other way, by choosing the path of least resistance." She attempted one last, desperate defense. "We were trying to help you after your stroke." "My minor stroke over a year ago, from which I have fully recovered," I countered, standing and straightening to my full height. "I am not incompetent, Emily. I am not a child. and I am not a burden to be managed. I am your father, and this was my home long before it ever became yours." The confrontation with Brian came later that same day, after Emily had left for work, unable to face me. He stormed into my room without knocking, his face flushed with anger. "What did you say to her?" he demanded. "She left here, looking like someone had died." I remained seated on my bed, a strange calm settling over me in the face of his fury. I showed her the truth. "What truth? That you're a manipulative old man who can't accept change? Who can't let his daughter have her own life?" I smiled slightly, a small gesture that only seemed to infuriate him more. "Is that what you tell yourself, Brian? That isolating me, disposing of my possessions, and planning to institutionalize me was all for Emily's independence?" His face hardened into a sneer. "You have no proof of anything." "Actually, I do." I gestured to my tablet sitting on the dresser. "Would you like to hear the recording of your conversation about Golden Sunset Acres? Or perhaps you'd prefer to see the bank records showing withdrawals from my personal account that conveniently coincide with your shopping sprees." For a moment, Brian looked genuinely frightened. Then his expression shifted to something sly and calculating. "It would be your word against mine. And let's be honest, Arthur, who would the authorities believe? A woman your age, especially one with a history of..." "Of what?" I challenged. "Medical issues," he finished smoothly. "Confusion, memory lapses. Dr. Linden has been very concerned about you." "That's interesting," I countered, my voice steady, "since I haven't seen Dr. Linden in over a year. I did, however, speak with her yesterday. She was quite surprised to hear about all these consultations you claim to have had with her." Brian's confidence faltered visibly. "You're bluffing. Call her and find out," I said, standing to face him directly. "This ends today, Brian. I am invoking the clause in the deed transfer. This house is legally mine again." His laugh was sharp and disbelieving. "What clause? What are you talking about?" "The one my attorney insisted on including. The one that allows me to revoke the transfer in the case of mistreatment or unsuitable living conditions." I met his gaze, unflinching. "The one Emily signed without reading carefully because she trusted me, just as I once trusted her." The color drained from Brian's face. "You can't do that." "I already have. The paperwork was filed yesterday." 3 days later, I sat in Jonathan's office, signing the final documents that would officially return the house to my name. Emily had not contested the action. After seeing the evidence, she couldn't. Brian had threatened legal action, but his protests fell silent when Jonathan calmly outlined exactly what would happen if he pursued that path. The public exposure, the potential criminal charges for financial exploitation. "So, what happens now?" Jonathan asked, as I set down the pen. I gazed out his office window at the autumn trees, their leaves a brilliant blaze of red and gold. "I start over," and that's exactly what I did. The first step was hiring a locksmith to change every single lock in the house. The second was arranging for Emily and Brian to remove their belongings, supervised by Jonathan and Leo, while I stayed at Leo's house across the street. I gave them 3 days, which was 3 days more than they had given me to adjust to living in a pantry. When I returned to my empty house, the silence was both eerie and liberating. The rooms that had once been filled with Eleanor's laughter, Emily's childhood games, and later Brian's cold disdain, now held only possibility. I walked from room to room, trailing my fingers along walls that were now painted in colors I hadn't chosen. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like meeting an old friend who has undergone dramatic and unwanted surgery. I spent that first night back in the master bedroom, sleeping in a new bed I'd purchased that afternoon, the first of many changes I would make to reclaim the space as my own. In the morning light, I began making lists. Furniture to buy, renovations to undo, colors to restore. But the most important decision came a week later, when Emily appeared on my doorstep, alone, her face haggard with regret. "Dad," she began, her voice rough with unshed tears. "I don't know how to even begin apologizing." I studied my daughter, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the weary slump of her shoulders. "Where's Brian?" "Gone," she said simply. "After everything came out, after I really saw what had been happening, I couldn't stay with him." I nodded, unsurprised. "And now I'm trying to figure out who I became," she admitted, her voice breaking, "and how to find my way back to being someone you could be proud of." I didn't invite her in immediately. Some wounds take time to heal, and trust, once so thoroughly broken, isn't easily restored. "That's a journey you'll need to make on your own, Emily." Tears finally filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "I know. I needed you to know that I'm trying." I softened slightly. "I'm glad to hear that." As the weeks passed, my house began to transform. Not back into what it had been, but into something new, something that was entirely mine. I rehung the few paintings I'd managed to save, and commissioned new ones from my former students. I rescued my grandfather's writing desk from the consignment shop, paying far more than it had been sold for, but considering it worth every penny. Leo and the Grey Rebellion became regular visitors, filling my dining room with laughter and stories every Thursday afternoon. I converted the sunroom into a proper art studio, finally pursuing the serious painting I had always postponed for one reason or another. And slowly, cautiously, I began the long process of rebuilding a relationship with Emily, setting the clear boundaries and expectations that should have been there all along. Brian never returned. I heard through the currents of community gossip that he had moved to another state, telling anyone who would listen that I was a difficult, manipulative old man. Perhaps in his version of reality, that was true. I no longer cared. One crisp December morning, as I sat in my new studio working on a watercolor of the winter garden, there was a knock at the door. Leo stood on the porch, a mischievous smile playing on his face. "Get your coat," he announced. "I found us a house." A house? A duplex. Side-by-side units, shared garden, separate entrances. He handed me a real estate listing. Perfect for two independent old broads who might occasionally appreciate having someone next door. I studied the photograph of a charming craftsman-style building with a sprawling garden and wide, welcoming front porches. "It's beautiful," I admitted, "but I just got my house back." Leo shrugged. "And now you can sell it. On your terms, for your benefit. Use the money to travel, to create art, to live your life without any shadows." I looked around at the house I had fought so hard to reclaim. It was mine again, but it was also heavy with memories, both beautiful and deeply painful. The idea of a fresh start, a place with no history, was suddenly, powerfully appealing. What would I do with all this space anyway? I mused aloud. "Exactly," Leo nodded approvingly. "So, are you coming to see it or not?" I reached for my coat. "Let me just get my wallet." 3 months later, I signed the papers selling my family home to a young couple with 2 small children. As I handed them the keys, I felt nothing but a sense of relief and good wishes. May their memories in this place be kinder than my most recent ones had been. Emily helped with the move to my new home, a gesture of reconciliation that I accepted with cautious optimism. Our relationship was different now, more balanced. She was learning to see me as a whole person, not just as her father, and I was learning to set the boundaries I should have established long ago. On my first evening in the new house, Leo and I sat on our adjoining porches, glasses of wine in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold. The Grey Rebellion would be arriving soon for a housewarming dinner. "You know what I've been thinking?" Leo said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What's that?" "Home isn't always where you've been. Sometimes it's where you choose to go next." I raised my glass in a toast. "To next chapters, then." "To next chapters," he agreed. "And to men who refuse to be filed away in pantries." I laughed, the sound free and genuine in the cool evening air. At 72, I had lost a house and found a home. I had lost a daughter and was slowly finding her again. Most importantly, I had lost myself, and then, against all odds, discovered a stronger, braver version of me waiting to emerge. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the new garden in a soft, golden light. Tomorrow, I would plant rose bushes along the fence, set up my easel in the east-facing window, and begin again, not as Emily's father or Eleanor's widower, but simply as Arthur, a man with a future still unfolding before him. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.